Welcome to the session with Chris Simon, our probably most far-traveled speaker at this conference, with his talk on Learning to Love DDD, A Tale of Two Products. Please welcome the speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for coming this afternoon. And huge thanks to KanDDDinsky for putting on such an amazing talk, to all the sponsors and helpers, volunteers, organisers, and all the other speakers. I've really loved attending so many incredible talks over the last 2 days. I am from Sydney, Australia. As noted, probably the furthest travelled speaker here today. And just to give you a little flavour of just how welcoming this conference is, this was an email I got sent when we were planning the logistics, and thankfully they did make good on this promise. I had a very cold beer on Sunday night. It was lovely. It got me thinking a little bit about beer, being Australian, and many of you being Germans. I suppose this is not an unusual topic. And I always like to think about how we talk about things. So, you know, we've got obviously English and German as different words for beer, but in Australia, at least, we've got lots of slang for beer. You know, you can talk about a cold one or a bevy. Let's get some brews, a brewski. Or you can be really crisp and precise with your language and talk about ales and lagers and Weissbier and so on. It's about this time when I deliver this talk to something that isn't KanDDDinsky. People are like, what are you talking about, Chris? Why are we talking about beer when we're not talking about domain-driven design? But I think with this audience, you probably know where I'm going with this, which is the power of language and the importance of crisp and precise words in our communications. And I don't think I'm alone in this idea. We've heard about it before, but you know, just to make the ultimate appeal to authority in this forum, Eric Evans, he doesn't describe himself as an architect or as a software developer. He describes himself as a domain linguist, and his consulting firm is called Domain Language. So I think I'm in good company with loving language and words in the practice of domain-driven design. So when we think about words and language and why it's important, what DDD has really helped me with is it's communication. You know, what are we doing? We're communicating with people, all sorts of different types of people. And one way of thinking about it is that we're having conversations in two different directions. One is with, you might call them our stakeholders or our domain experts. Sometimes people call them the business, although I don't like that term because I like to think of myself as being part of the business. So I like to say other parts of the business, or even more crisp and precise, the marketing team or the sales team, or even more crisp and precise, John from the marketing teams or Johanna from the sales team. Because if you're in a company, hopefully you can actually talk about the people involved. So when I hear developers saying, oh, the business wants this, I say, that doesn't tell me anything. Who are you talking about? Who precisely are you talking about? We're DDD practitioners, right? Let's be precise. And the other, you know, sometimes we have these conversations verbally. Sometimes we use visual modeling tools like event storming and domain storytelling, and these all help. But fundamentally, what's the purpose of all these tools? It's to achieve a shared understanding. So I think, you know, it's important not to lose sight of the purpose of why we use these tools. The other conversation we have is with our fellow software developers, and yes, we might have conversations verbally, but a lot of these conversations happen in the code itself. You know, the computer doesn't care what you call a variable, but the developers who are going to read the code care. And especially the developers in 10 years that you will never meet care what you call the language, what you call the variables. And of course, this is Eric's great insight, is that there's great power in having these conversations using a shared language. And I don't think I need to explain it to this audience, but this is what he called the ubiquitous language, and you know, having a common terminology across these two conversations that we're having, one in code and one in person. So this is a personal journey talk. This is my experience of learning to love domain-driven design. And it kind of, you know, how it helps me understand the mistakes I made earlier in my career, you know, where I went wrong in hindsight, and how it helped me to, you know, hopefully reduce the harm of the mistakes I continue to make in my career. So with this background, the subtitle of this talk is A Tale of Two Products, so I'm going to introduce our protagonists. The first is called Flexi Schools. In Australia, Flexi Schools services about 2 million people now. We launched it in about 2008. I was the co-founder and CTO. And in 2008, I think, you know, Eric Evans' book was published in 2003, so it had been around for 5 years. And I'm sure by that time a lot of people knew about domain-driven design, but sadly I was not one of them. And then the other product we're going to talk about is called LanternPay, which we launched in 2015. By this time I had learned about domain-driven design, and I was really excited to give it a try with this product. Thankfully, both of them have actually been quite successful in the markets in Australia. But as I said, there's some lessons to be learned from not using it, DDD, and using DDD. Before we go on, I just want to note that I'm not really involved with either of these products day to day anymore. I take full responsibility for all the issues I'm about to describe, but I want to acknowledge that both systems are now in the custodianship of some incredible software teams who have fixed all of my mistakes. And so I want to thank them if they're watching this video in the future for all of their hard work, which has definitely contributed to the commercial success of the products. So I'm going to try and distill these 3 lessons. And I think these are lessons probably many people in this audience have already learnt or already heard about from other people, but hopefully there's something in my experience of learning these lessons that might help you apply them in a different way or get a different perspective on them. So I'm going to start with the first one, that it's better to be explicit than implicit. And we're going to start with Flexi Schools, because this is where I made that mistake. So Flexi Schools, to talk a little bit more about the domain of Flexi Schools. In Australia, historically, if you have children at school and you wanted to provide them with some lunch, you have 2 options. You can make them some food and send that in with them, or you can buy them some food. And the way that buying food worked is that you would write on a brown paper bag what you wanted them to have, a Vegemite sandwich often, and put some money in the bag. And the child would take it to school, put it in a box. Someone from the food preparation place, which we often call a canteen or a tuck shop, would collect the bags, tally them up, work out how many ham sandwiches, how many Vegemite sandwiches, how many apple juices, make cash change into the bag, and then at lunchtime the child would come out and their bag had their food in it, like magic. Now, by the time we launched, this was becoming really difficult for schools to do, primarily because of a lot of parents were starting to both work, and so they had less time, so they were buying more food for their kids, but also the canteens were usually staffed by parent volunteers, and so with both parents working, they had less time to volunteer. And the process I just described, you can imagine it's quite intensive, tallying up these bag orders and making change, and so they were crying out for something to help them, and that's what we provided them with, a service that would allow parents to put the lunch order in online. Being 2008, it was about just to coincided with the launch of iPhone, so it was pre-smartphone in a way, but now obviously there's an app and it works on a smartphone. And in the canteen, it would print out labels and a report telling them exactly what they had to make so they could get a jump on the food preparation. And this allowed them to actually make healthier food because they had more time, because of course making healthy food takes more time than shoving some pies in an oven. And it actually helped a lot of schools turn around their canteen operations to the point where the canteens were providing money back to the school and acting as a fundraiser so they could supply more services to the kids, like play equipment and so on. So this felt really good. We were really happy with how this went. But we're not here just to talk about that side of things. Let's get into the modeling. And as I said, we didn't use DDD on this product. We came from, well, my background, I'd learned about entity relationship modeling, third normal form database design, so that's kind of what we started with. Hopefully nothing controversial in this model. We've got orders, order items with a quantity, with a reference to a supplier item, which you can think of as like a catalog or a menu. Pretty straightforward model. Kind of worked for some simple things that we were selling, or the canteens were selling. But pretty quickly, it became apparent that they wanted to sell more than that. They wanted to give some optionality. They wanted to let the students choose the type of bread that they might have, or add some ingredients to the sandwich. I don't recommend lettuce with a Vegemite sandwich, by the way, but maybe with the ham sandwich. And so we had to decide, well, how we're going to adapt the model to incorporate this. And I think at the time, I had a lot of fear and uncertainty, and I was worried because every school seemed to want something a bit different. And we didn't know what was around the corner. So we had to think about, what's next? We had this question mark. And, in my naive youth, I thought, I know what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a super generic, flexible, powerful model that can handle anything that any customer throws at us. Yeah, really smart idea. So we expanded the order item into a hierarchy. So we had a parent order item and a child order item, which was completely not confusing when our customers were actually parents and children. We referenced the supplier item to a template, which would define a number of categories with a minimum and a maximum on the category, so that if it was a minimum one, maximum one, that was kind of like a radio button type selection, and the UI would infer to display a radio button when it saw min, max one, and a checkbox if it was a min 0, max 1. And it kind of worked. It handled what all the canteens were throwing at us. And so we thought, wow, we're geniuses. We come up with this amazing, flexible model that is going to serve us well into the future. And then schools started wanting more services. They wanted to be able to sell uniforms and tickets to school play or some sort of event at the school. I was like, hey, we got this. This super generic model can handle it. I mean, what's the difference really between the size of a t-shirt and a slice of ham on a sandwich? They're the same thing, right? Like, so the parent item was the uniform, the child item was the size, the parent item was the sandwich, the child item was the slice of ham or the lettuce. And you know, because we made it a hierarchy, you could nest it deep, so you could have a combo meal with you know, your sandwich and your drink and your apple or whatever. And it was great. You know, we rolled out these services really quickly. The schools were happy, and everything was good until it wasn't. And the challenge came when, you know, schools weren't able to set up their own menus. It was too hard for them. We had put a lot of effort into making sure the user experience for parents was really simple, but for the administrators trying to set things up, they were struggling, to the point where we had to hire more and more people to actually do the setup of the menus. And we had to spend a lot of time training them in how to do the setup of the menus. And so they were like, I just want a radio button. And the system would say, well, what category min-max would you like? And of course, they were like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know what this means. And in the other direction, we had our software developers saying, I'm trying to respond to a support ticket or respond to a bug report, and we were hiring more software developers and they just couldn't engage with the system because none of the requests looked anything like the code. And of course, this was what software development used to be like before we had DDD. So I was starting to get a bit worried at this point, but I didn't really know what else to do. Of course, once I learned about DDD, I realized the mistake we'd made. We'd created a really implicit generic model, but we had humans that had explicit models in their head. And by creating the generic implicit model, we forced the humans to do the translation between their explicit models and the implicit models. And that's not really very fair on them because that's not what they're good at. So if we had really interrogated the language that our customers had been using, we would have heard sentences like, the customer should be able to choose, a slight type of bread, or, the sandwich, what did I say here? They can have whatever ingredients they want on the sandwich, but the standard sandwich comes with lettuce and tomato. And so terms like ingredient, which are a little bit more precise, would have helped us understand that actually a uniform size is not the same thing as an ingredient on a sandwich. And that would have actually really helped with some other requirements that had come along, because as it turned out, they wanted different payment cycles and different policies on cancellation and things for these different orders. But because we'd stuffed everything into the same model, we just kept piling on hack after workaround to make these new requirements work. And so, this was the lesson for me. The generic model served a purpose, but it caused a lot of problems as well. And I think in hindsight, I probably would have preferred to have just bitten the bullet and embraced the fact that these were and should have been different models, and it would have been better to be explicit in our system design. So that's the implicit. That's an example to add to your repertoire of explicit is better than implicit. So the second lesson was about the need to co-create the ubiquitous language. And so for this, I'm going to start talking about LanternPay. So actually, Matthias's talk yesterday morning talked a lot about this concept, and this is another example of it. And in our case, I think it was coming from a slightly different origin, but the same idea. So before we get into that, just talk a little bit about LanternPay and what it did. We're entering healthcare insurance sector, another fintech product. Healthcare workers, what we call service providers, would provide, maybe a general practitioner or a physiotherapist would do some work, and then they would want to get paid for that work. And if the person seeing them, they might pay cash, but they might also be entitled to have their service paid for by some sort of agency. And it might be a private insurance company, or it might be a government scheme or agency that would support them, because Australia has a whole bunch of these schemes set up for different conditions. Maybe a road traffic accident, your recovery is covered, or maybe if you're born with a disability or you require a disability, you can get some support from the government and they will fund some of the services that you need. And the business opportunity here was that the service providers were struggling because there was this huge range of funding bodies that would fund them, but everyone had a different process for getting paid. Some of them still required to send in a paper invoice and wait 6 months for payment. Some of them had some digital processes, but everyone had a different digital process. So, there's always complicated and difficult exercises that the service providers had to go through to get paid. So we saw an opportunity to provide a unified, coherent model, a single interface, a port of call for the service providers to request payment in a coherent, simple way, and to get paid no matter who was providing the funding. Something I want to call out here is that the model that we started with was basically saying LanternPay would determine if the work was correct. And this came from our first customer. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but just to be clear about the model, we were determining if the work was valid, if it was eligible to be funded, and then just initiating payment and informing the funding body that we were going to do the payment. So the trick here, of course, we were launching a new product into a market that never had something like this. There'd been a few things operating in the private insurance space, but nothing across the breadth of funding bodies that we were hoping to tackle. So we didn't have any domain experts, at least not initially. We saw the business opportunity, but learning about the domain was tricky at first. But thankfully, through some great business development activities, we found a first program that was willing to talk to us. And so we started to learn about some key concepts in the domain. So from our first program, obviously there was a lot more than this, but just, I guess, extracting some of the key concepts. So, as I talked about, the concept of a service provider, the entity that was doing the work, and the concept of a claim, or a claim for payment, which is basically saying, I've done some work, I believe it's eligible, could you pay me? And so we built the first iteration of the system using this model. It was pretty simple and straightforward, and it was working in the first program. But then we managed to sign up another program, and we learned a bit more about how they thought about the world. And it was completely different. Not just extra complexity in the model, but even using the same words in a different way. And this was really confusing because we were trying to do DDD at this point, and we were like, oh, but we need to follow the language of the domain experts, but we had domain experts giving us two different languages for what we thought was the same process. So just to briefly talk about that, they really cared about the individual providing the service. So imagine a doctor has a license, they wanted to know who that doctor was. The first program didn't care, but the second one did. They wanted to track that doctor if they were working at different clinics or different hospitals and see the kind of work they were doing across multiple arrangements. And so they had this concept of a billing provider, which was the taxable entity that the individual was working for. They used the word claim in a completely different way. If someone had a traffic injury, they would submit a claim to say, I've been injured, and that claim represented the entire funding block, maybe $40,000 to cover their healthcare costs over the next 3 to 5 years, as compared with the first program that used the word claim to represent an individual request for payment for a single instance of a service being provided. So we were kind of a bit gobsmacked here, and it's like, well, DDD hasn't told us what to do in this situation. What are we going to do? It did give us some advice, and so what we did was we thought, well, the advice is, well, if you've got two different languages, you've got two different bounded contexts. And we thought, well, that's a bit troublesome for our whole business model if we have to build a new bounded context for every program that we sign up. So we thought we've got two options here. We could do this. We could build a new bounded context for every customer, or we could say, well, a request for payment is kind of the same thing no matter what they call it. Is this just a labeling issue? Is it not a modeling issue? It was really impossible to know at this point because we hadn't spent enough time immersed in the domain. But we decided, because option one represented too much of a challenge to our hypothesis for the whole business idea, that we were going to go with option two. But what I really loved about having embraced domain-driven design for this project is that we did it with eyes wide open. We chose this model, but we knew there were risks to it, and we committed to monitoring the cognitive load introduced by going down this pathway and acting quickly if we discovered that it was causing us issues. So we came up with a new unified model, and we refactored the code, the whole system that we had built so far to represent this model in the database, in the code, in the UI code, everywhere. And that was a really important thing to have done. Even in the short space of time between deciding on this model and doing the refactoring, we already started to see the challenges that were arising from the discrepancy between the language that the other parts of the business were using and the language that the code was using. So, okay, that's great. We've co-created a ubiquitous language with our domain experts. Our customers have got slightly different languages, but that's okay. We put in place an anti-corruption layer to try and absorb that if we had to do some integration and things. One of the other things we did with LanternPay was we embraced event-driven architecture and used event storming. And this also helped in a different way to co-create the ubiquitous language because it helped us identify concepts that had not existed until we introduced our system. And so we had a simple onboarding flow where the biller would register and then we would validate their registration. But then we had to also validate, particularly for this second funding program, that they were valid to submit to that program because that program wanted to be able to block certain billers and say, look, we think you've been fraudulent in the past, we're not going to let you submit claims to us anymore. The first program hadn't had this concept. And in fact, even the second program, they had never had to think about it in terms of a biller's verification status with respect to a given program because they only thought about the world from their perspective. Nobody had, until this point, tried to offer a platform that supported multiple funding programs. So this is, I guess, it's a simple one, but it's an interesting example of a concept that was really formed by us attempting to provide this system. And so this is another example of what I mean by co-creating the ubiquitous language. We couldn't just discover it from the domain experts because they would never have come up with this until we started exploring the interaction effect of the system we were building into the domain that we were trying to support. I don't think I really need to give this advice to this audience, but sometimes when I talk to people who embrace event-driven architecture and think they're doing event storming, and they think, oh, well, we're not doing CRUD, so we're all good, we're doing DDD. And then I start seeing events like Build a Created, and I have to say, okay, you're still doing CRUD. Just because you've got an event, if you're calling it Build a Created, you've lost a really rich opportunity here to find the crisp and precise term that is going to represent what's actually going on here. Created, updated a domain term, database terms, they're not domain terms. So don't do that. Although, as I say, in KanDDDinsky, I don't think I need to share that advice. So talk a lot about the importance of language and communication and achieving a shared understanding. So I want to share a practical tip today that I found really helpful with this, and I think it's something that will support your conversations no matter whether you're using other tools like event storming or domain storytelling, to support the gathering of that shared understanding. And it's a little bit inspired by continuous integration, in a way. I think we all understand the purpose of continuous integration. It's to give us fast feedback on if our code is working. We run unit tests, we do a build, we find out if the thing compiles and if the tests pass. So you can sort of think about this tip as like unit tests for your conversations. And there's two flip sides to it, and it's kind of based around the idea of open questions and closed questions. So if you haven't heard about that terminology before, an open question is one that you ask, like, what did you think of breakfast this morning? You're giving the responder freedom to answer in any way that they like. A closed question is more like, did you like breakfast this morning? There's only really a yes or no answer. So that's a closed question. You're not giving them much freedom with which to answer. But both of those forms of question have value, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you are trying to explain something to somebody, an open question is a really good way to do it. I like to ask, can you play back to me what you've understood so that I can make sure I've explained myself properly? I tack that last bit on the end to make sure that they don't think I'm accusing them of being stupid, and more that I'm implying that maybe I didn't do a good job of the explanation. Makes the process go a little bit more quickly. And if they play it back to you and you realise actually they haven't understood, that's a red fail on your unit test for this conversation, so you can iterate again and explain it again. And if you think about it, that's kind of what we're doing with these visual modelling tools. We're trying to get someone that we're explaining something to play back to us what they've understood by drawing it out or putting the sticky notes up, and then we can check if we've communicated what we were trying to communicate properly. And the other direction, you use a closed question. You yourself explain back what you've understood and ask, is that correct? So is that correct? A closed question, there's only yes or no answer. Again, green and red, unit test on the conversation. And if it's red, then you can prompt another iteration to try and make sure that you can explore a little bit more and make sure you've understood correctly. So just a little practical tool that I've found helpful. So the last point is about embracing continuous change. So if we think about sources of change, my experience has been, there's many sources of change, but if we think about the domain-oriented sources of change, you can loosely classify them into two types. There's the types of change where the domain itself actually changes. The business is launching new products or adding new feature requests. And so the reality is the domain is now a new domain, and maybe your code doesn't align with that domain anymore. But there's also the one where your understanding of the domain has evolved. The domain itself hasn't changed, but through analysis and interrogation and conversations, you've gained a greater understanding. I think this is a fascinating scenario when you think about technical debt, because as soon as you have a better understanding of the domain, you feel frustrated by how hard it is to engage with your system, because you would like the system to be different. You would like it to reflect your new understanding of the domain, because that would make it easier to implement your new requirements, which is kind of the subjective experience of working with a system that has high technical debt. But in this case, the system hasn't changed, you have. So a change in you has introduced technical debt into a system that hasn't changed. So I think technical debt, in a way, is very relational. It's relational between the team that is working with the system and the system itself. If you think about systems that we often describe as being riddled with technical debt, a common thing that's going on there is actually it's a new team working with that system. And the original team that built it probably doesn't have the same experience of technical debt. So just a slight shift on a perspective there. But we had a really big change with LanternPay that struck us, and there's some interesting characteristics of it that I wanted to explore. We got our third program, and we said to them, great, we've got a really consistent, unified model here. We're working with 2 other programs. It's working really well. Tell us how we should decide whether the claims are accurate. What rules do you apply if you're working out whether a payment, a client is eligible for payment? And so they told us, and we went about implementing these rules. And it all seemed to, initially we thought we'd got it right. This is how we'd expected the system to evolve. Every program was probably going to have a few different rules, and we would implement it. We built like a flexible strategy pattern-based idea around, adding new rules into a chain of rules that would get executed depending on the program. And every rule might have different data that it needs to refer to, so there was a little bit of extra integration to pull in the data that it needed to refer to. But what it turned out is that they had taken our question literally, and when we said, what rules do you use to check whether a claim is valid, they were talking about the rules that they were actually applying to check if a claim was valid. So it's kind of amazing that it didn't come up in the conversations, but they were actually re-executing the rules. And so if we ended up with a slightly different decision, and we didn't even realize they were doing this, they were declining a claim that we had already approved and initiated payment on. This is a terrible outcome, right? Because their whole job is making sure they don't pay for things they shouldn't have to pay for. And they asked us, well, could you just not pay until we get back to you and tell you what we've decided? And this was a huge red flag, because implementing that requirement into our system totally broke every fundamental assumption we'd made about the fact that we had to execute these rules. So this was greatly concerning, but again, because we'd embraced domain-driven design and we committed to treating these situations as something worthy of investigation and deep diving, and then updating the system to reflect any new understanding that we had, we really dug into it and we thought, well, maybe they're right, maybe we shouldn't execute the rules. Maybe we made a mistake. And there was another interesting thing that had been happening right now, which is that we had about 3 or 4 other programs that we'd been talking to, and they'd all sounded interested initially, but the conversation started to dry up and they stopped getting back to us. And so once we had this idea, well, maybe we didn't need to execute the rules, maybe these programs were worried because, much like our third program, they wanted to be in control of what rules were going to be executed. And so we pitched it to them and said, actually, we're about to launch a new model here. What would you think if you guys were the ones that executed the decisions about whether or not the claims were valid? And they, of course, came back straight away and said, yeah, that's exactly what we want. Why weren't you offering that from the start? And we're like, well, why didn't you ask for it? But, that's the way these things go. So we told them, well, we're going to do this, and they signed up almost straight away. It was amazing. So now we had the challenge of what to do with our first programs that we had implemented the rules for, because they'd been pretty clear that they needed us to implement the rules. So we went back and spoke to them, and they said, well, no, we never really wanted you to execute the rules. We just didn't have the resources to build a decision engine or to offer the integration capability so that you could ask us what our decision was going to be. So we just let you do it because you seemed willing to do the work for us. So our whole understanding of the domain had come from a technical commercial constraint that they'd never explained to us. But that was quite frustrating, because we put a lot of effort into this rules engine, and now we were basically about to set fire to it and burn it down to the ground. But in another sense, it was really freeing, because it felt actually now we'd developed some great insight, and this was actually far more what the market needed. And the fact that new programs were asking for it, it was going to work better for our third program, and the first programs were saying actually that's what they'd always wanted. And actually, as it turned out now, they did have some resources and they were willing to put some effort into building that engine. We realized, well, actually this is the right product. But of course, we just spent years building the wrong product. So what were we going to do? Well, we had to build a new product. We didn't have a choice. So what we did was we actually took the decision engine that we had built, and we conceptually moved it up into this layer of the funding program. And so it was acting effectively as a proxy for the first 2 programs. And then we built a new V2, which was more of a routing engine, had a completely new domain model. It had a lot of the same concepts in it, a lot of the same terminology, but they were represented very differently. They didn't have the same rules. They followed different state flows and so on. And thankfully, because we were using event-driven architecture, it worked really well, because the interaction with the programs needed to be asynchronous, because sometimes they needed to take some time to make a decision. And so we built an asynchronous integration model for the service providers as well, and this all worked really well. And because we had our V1 program there, it was able to continue to offer that capability for those programs until they had completed implementing their own decision engines. And over time, we set up this V2 model to have a flexible routing capability. So then when they were ready, we just flicked the switch, started routing the claims to their engine. And actually, I heard a couple of months ago, we completely turned off V1. So that was very exciting. Also a bit sad because we put a lot of effort into it, but it was better for everybody that that's how it happened. So I think the interesting thing here is that if we hadn't committed to exploring any of these red flags that came up, we probably wouldn't have had a commercially successful product. Those new clients wouldn't have signed up with us, and the third client was about to leave us because they weren't getting what they wanted out of it. So this had a really significant impact on the commercial outcome for this business. And interestingly, we kind of ended up with a bit of a hybrid of that first decision that we had to make. We did have a unified language in our routing layer, and because some of the programs had their own interfaces, we had to build integrations with them. We kind of built these program adapters, which were a form of anti-corruption layer, where we were able to embrace the language of the program and translate from our unified language to their language in the cases where we needed to. Some of them were happy to integrate directly to our interface, so we were like the open host service and they were conforming to us, but some of them didn't, and we built these adapter layers. But the adapter layers were really thin translation layers rather than anything that embodied a great deal of business logic. But it took us years, of course, to develop the insights to work out, you know, in that first conception we had option 1, 2 contexts, option 2, a unified model. We ended up with a hybrid, but we didn't see the hybrid as an option at first because we had no idea of how to slice it, what part could be unified and what parts could be extracted. But by engaging with the clients over the years and starting to gain this insight and understanding, we were able to determine what could actually be common and unified and what needed to be segregated and customer specific. So sometimes I think in the context of change and embracing change, there's an interesting aspect to Conway's law that I think it's worth noting. I think probably everyone in this room has seen this formulation of Conway's law, the idea that the architecture will reflect the team structure. But there's a paragraph, and I think it's just even the next paragraph, maybe the one after it, that I don't see quoted nearly as often, and I think it's quite significant, which is that the design concept which occurs first is almost never the best possible. And this, of course, is exactly what happened to us. And I just wanted to call this out because I think, you know, sometimes we get very excited about things like team topologies and coming up with great team structures, and it's great that that aligns with our, you know, model, and we're using like the reverse Conway maneuver or whatever. But you know, if you're going to embark on a major refactor, you have to take into consideration the impact on the teams and the restructure of the teams. And of course, changing code and changing team structures is not necessarily you know, easy to do in the same timeframes and so on. So it's, I don't have any concrete advice in relation to this. I just think it's an interesting point worth noting. There's another comment that I often get when I talk about this was like, okay, well that's great, Chris, you're the CTO, you could just make the decision, or at least you had a lot of power and influence in the organisation with which to say, yes, we're going to do this big refactor. I don't have that influence. I'm you know, a tech lead or a developer, and I can see that there's a need for a major refactor and that will really help us, but I just kept getting asked to implement new features. So this is a really simple model that I found really helpful in relation to this. This idea that actually what the business is trying to do is maximize profit or impact if you're a non-profit. And you can think about this profit as coming from a delicate balance between cost, risk, and revenue. And part of the reason I think as engineers we sometimes struggle to get the work that we see necessary prioritized is that there's actually two conversations going on, one of which we're focused on cost and risk. You know, we're focused on developer efficiency or hosting cost or security risk or bug risk or availability risk. And our colleagues in other parts of the business are focused on revenue. So we've got different priorities, we've got different beliefs and values about what's important, and we're trying to have conversations about priorities without articulating explicitly, you know, why we think these things are important. So I found explaining this model to people and saying, actually, guys, we're on the same team. We're trying to maximize profit. And if we can reduce costs and if we can reduce risk, it will have a positive impact on profit. That can really help. But also in cases like ours, it's really powerful to like step across to the other side and think about what's the revenue opportunity here. If you can articulate the revenue that can be gained by the refactor that you want to do, the new features you'll be able to offer, the commercial value that's there, you'll probably find you have more fruitful conversations about these things if you're in that situation where you're struggling to get this work prioritized. Something else that can really help with this, of course, is having built up trusting relationships with your counterparties in other parts of the business. And I do really believe that this starts with not calling them the business and acting like you're not part of the business. If you think of yourself as all being on the same team, you are all part of the business, and you actually take the time to build relationships, you know, not just be cutting in the code, but actually reach out to them, get to know them, get to understand what's important to them. This will help build trust so that when you say to them this is important, they'll believe you. And if you are able to build up a track record of following through on what you say is going to happen, that will help as well. So I really do encourage everybody to think about how often do you connect directly with someone outside of the engineering team? How well do you know the people outside of the engineering team? Is the fact that you call them the business because you actually don't know any of their names? And if the answer is yes, maybe make a point of getting to know them. I think it will help. So we're getting close to the end, but so to recap, we had these 3 lessons: make the implicit explicit, as I learnt to my pain with Flexi Schools and the model where a t-shirt size was not a slice of ham. Co-create the ubiquitous language, especially if you're in a startup land and you're offering a service that's never been offered before. There will be concepts that haven't existed, or you might be engaging with customers that have evolved their own languages, even though they're trying to do similar or the same things. And lastly, embrace continuous change. The value you will get if you can embody your lessons learned or reflect changes to the domain into the system as they occur will be immense, and it will actually help you continue to operate smoothly into the future. So I want to finish by talking a little bit about a little tool that I've been working on, which was inspired by a lot of these experiences. It's called Contextive. It's an IDE extension. It's an open source IDE extension, currently only available for Visual Studio Code. But what it does is it's like a living documentation tool. So if you put a YAML file in your repository with the terminology of your domain in it, then this tool will pick up that YAML file, and if you're working in the code base, it will offer tooltips and autocomplete derived from this language definition. And what I really like about this is because it's not, you know, obviously there's language features like, you know, you can put comments, structured comments on classes, and that will, you know, you could put some domain knowledge in those comments, but it only shows up if you're referencing that class. Whereas with this tool, because it's outside of the code, you know, it can pick up the use of domain terminology even in terms that have suffixes or prefixes or are combined with other words, like cargo ID in this example. Of course, I've taken this from the Blue Book, cargo domain, this example. And because it's in the YAML file, it doesn't just work in code. Works in Markdown as well. So if you're doing documentation in Markdown in your code, you can be guided to use the ubiquitous language in your documentation, and you can get access to these hover terms. And it's my hope that in using this tool and having these definitions shoved in your face while you're working on the code, it'll prompt you to reflect on actually, is what I'm implementing aligned with this definition and these usage examples that are being shown here. And what I'd really like to do, is just launched this recently, is actually extend it, not just to more IDEs, but into other situations where we're having these conversations, like a Slack bot that can detect the use of domain terms or ubiquitous language terms in conversations, or a browser extension that will do the same if you're writing an email or responding to a customer support ticket request. And what I'd really love to see happen here is have a feature where a customer service operator can highlight a sentence in a customer support ticket and say, add to the example sentences, and the tool will add it to the central definition so that the developers will see this example sentence pop up in their hover while they're working on the code. So like I said, it's a pretty new tool. If anyone would like to help me build it, you're very welcome, especially anybody that knows anything about IntelliJ extensions, because I've been struggling a bit with that part. And if anyone just wants to use it and give some feedback, that'd be really appreciated as well. So I think I've kind of rushed through that. I thought I was going to take a bit longer, but that's kind of the end of my talk. So thank you very much for coming, and I think, as per usual, happy to have a chat about any of it out in the hallway after this. So thank you very much.